Hi and welcome everyone. My name is Thomas Maurer. I'm a cloud advocate at Microsoft. We are part of the Azure engineering team and we do a couple of different things like producing content, developing content, delivering content like this presentation, for example, as well as obviously engaging with communities and customers around the world to figure out what is working for our customers, what is not working, and how can we improve our solutions for our customers. I'm also joined by Dominik Zemp, who is a cloud solution architect at Microsoft. He will talk more about the enterprise scale landing zones in just a bit. He will also add a couple of demos to show you how that actually can be implemented. Now, in today's recording, we are going to talk about Azure Architecture Best Practices, right? So we're going to have a look at like why is architecture important, why are we going to do that, how are things working, how are we actually implementing the cloud adoption framework, and what tools does Microsoft offer. So today, this is our agenda. So we're going to talk a little bit about why Azure architecture, that's kind of like going to be the intro, why it is so important, why should we consider it very early on in the stage when we do this. And then obviously we're going to have a look at the tooling we give you and the frameworks we give you with the cloud adoption framework. I'm going to explain a little bit what it is, talk a little bit about landing zones and explain that. And then Dominik Zemp will talk more about the enterprise scale landing zones, the design areas and how you can actually implement those and how they work. And he has also some great demos for that. We also will have some time for Q&A. So we will obviously go out and you can ask your questions and we will try to answer them during the session as well as at the end. So let us get started. Why is cloud adoption important? Why is cloud architecture important when we do cloud adoption? So when we talk about the cloud, usually the cloud is all about acceleration, speed, and agility, right? So we can really go out quickly, deploy new services. We can change things very, very quickly. And this is great, right? Moving fast and breaking things is fantastic. Until the thing you break is your neck, right? And I have seen that from many, many customers who actually went out and they started very, very quickly. They did not pay much attention on how they're actually going to start and develop things. And then they realized, okay, even though we can change certain things really quickly, we kind of now did a couple of things which do not really help us for going forward. And this can be multiple factors. It's not just about technology. It can also be about processes they implemented and how they worked. And so this is what we want to talk about when we talk about cloud architecture. Now, what is really important when we talk about this, again, it's a lot about technology. And again, Dominik will have a lot of demos where it is about technology and how you actually implement enterprise landing zones. But we understand that like when people are adopting the cloud, when they're moving to the cloud, this change is more than just a technology change, right? This has impact on people, on culture, and this can be very difficult and it can feel risky for a lot of people. Now, it really, in my opinion, from the learnings we have, it really requires a radical change in thinking, right? It really needs to be like a cultural shift within the organization with types of how you're working together. In the past, probably IT departments had these silos, right? Where you had a team just focusing on one specific area. Like, for example, you had the networking team, you had the storage team, you had the hypervisor team, and so on, right? And what we can see, and I can tell you from many, many of these projects, that we see kind of like melting these things together. You can't have these really separate silos anymore. You need to bring people together. Obviously, you have experts in networking, you have experts in storage, you have experts in like managing virtual machines, in certain applications, in security. However, they also need to have kind of like that T-shape learning and knowledge. So they need to have like a broad understanding how things actually come together. And then obviously they have some strengths in between. But you really like need to break down these silos. And there's definitely a cultural shift and organizational shift going on, which when it comes to cloud adoption. And I think that is also a very important part, and that is where the cloud adoption framework also comes in. It's not just about giving you technical guidance in, okay, this is like how the architecture should look like, this is how your landing zones or your Azure environment should look like, but also helping you to do like working when it comes to operation and multiple other things as well. Now, what does the cloud adoption framework actually do? It really brings together, as I just mentioned, technology, people, and processes, right? So it tries to align all of these and takes all of these pillars actually in account and actually works them and brings them together. And the cloud adoption framework really is proven guidance we have built. It's partly documentation, which shows best practices, which we had learnings from implementing with many of our customers from the product teams directly. So we took all that knowledge and built these best practices, give you this documentation. But we didn't stop there. We also then offer templates and tools which help you to integrate the cloud adoption framework value within your environment. And then obviously align business, people, and technology in the strategy, achieve business goals, and not just like, okay, we need to like technical goals. And then at the end to actually deliver faster results with control and stability in mind. Now, and that is actually a very important part, right? We still want to take advantage of the cloud and the speed and agility it offers to actually also deliver these results in a fast time frame. But then on the other hand, we want to keep control, we want to keep the environment stable, and so that is also an important part to actually balance that out. And that is where we have again the cloud adoption framework. And again, the cloud adoption framework really is proven guidance to accelerate your cloud adoption journey. And what you can see here, we try to offer it from many different stages where you are, right? So some companies are probably further in their cloud adoption journey. Some of them are really at the beginning. So the cloud adoption framework really starts from the very early on stage where you actually go out and define the strategy, then lay out the plan and get the readiness done, and then until you actually go and adopt the environment. But also includes things which you need to do continuously, like govern your environment to keep making sure it's under your control and secure, and then also obviously operate and optimize your environment, right? So the cloud adoption framework is not just one way of implementing or migrating solutions. It is really also about then actually how do I build operations around it? How do I manage it? How do I govern it? Now, one thing which is really important to me is actually how that actually looks like. So let me quickly show you how you can go and check out the cloud adoption framework. So the cloud adoption framework can be found on the Microsoft documentation pages, right? So if you use your favorite search engine like Microsoft Bing, you can search for the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework and you will come directly to that site. And here you have different pillars and different informations about how you get actually started, right? And so you can see here again these different pillars I just showed you. You have the getting started information to actually find out more about the cloud adoption framework and how to use it. And then you have the strategy, planning, ready, migrate, innovate, govern, manage, and organize part, which gives you a lot of options there. You also can find all the tools here for some assessments, and you can also go out and take our Microsoft Learn modules and learning paths to actually learn more about Azure in general, about different technologies, but also about the cloud adoption framework. Now, let me quickly show you how that actually looks like. So if I go and have a look at the get starting part, I actually get some information about how to use the cloud adoption framework. And again, it explains you in more depth what I just told you. And then you can find here on the left side, you can find the different stages of your cloud journey. For example, defining the strategies, defining and finding out the motivations for your cloud project. Again, we will talk about that in just a little bit more. But then it goes all the way down. How do I actually then get your environment ready? How do I get my landing zones ready? How do I then adopt my environment? And we also can see here, it's very important. There's not just like one way, which is migration. There's also something when we talk about it is innovate, when we actually build new solutions or modernize our existing solution, which is kind of like an ongoing process, right? Even if you migrate, you probably want to then go out and modernize these workloads as well. And then obviously you also, as I mentioned, you have information about actually managing your environment. You get Azure management guidance, you get best practices, and much, much more. This is where you can find more about the cloud adoption framework, right? However, there are some tools I want to talk about. So one of them is actually the Cloud Journey Tracker. This one is really helpful if you're in your cloud stage and you don't know really where you are and where you need to do a couple of work. So this one, I will show you that in just a bit, and it will help you to actually find out where you are and focus and prioritize your areas you have to work on, and it also flags potential blockers. On the other side, I also want to quickly show you, while you're actually working in the Azure portal, we also have the Quick Start Center. And that is where you can actually go out and have a look at guidance and information from the Cloud Adoption Framework without it actually leaving it. So let me quickly show you these tools. When it comes to assessments, we basically have that assessment page. Again, you can find the link to that in our presentation, but also in the Cloud Adoption Framework itself, there is a section with tools where you actually can go out and find the links to these assessment pages. Now, if you scroll down, you can find out that we have a couple of different solutions here, which you can use our assessment tools, not just about the Cloud Journey Tracker, but also, for example, for the well-architected review for your applications. But what I actually want to show you is the Cloud Journey Tracker. So what I'm going to do here, I create a new assessment, give it a name, and then this one will really go through and ask you a set of questions. And this will help you then to actually find out where your gaps are. Now, there are a couple of questions you need to answer. And to be honest, I will save us that time because like in a good cooking show, I already prepared here my cloud journey. So I already run through this assessment, and then I actually get some of the results here, which I can find all the information. And you can see here that my overall result is actually pretty good. I'm doing in my cloud journeys, I'm doing some really good job. However, I can also find the gaps here, right? You can see here when it comes to governance management, I'm pretty much okay. However, I have some problems in the readiness part, as well as I can also do probably a little bit more in strategy and planning. And so not just telling me where I find these gaps, but then also give me some recommendations what I actually need to take care of. So here you can then find more about the results and you get the recommendations. So if I click on for more information, I can then find out, okay, these are the things I need to look out for. And so for example, in this case, I need to look at re-architect an on-premise app to an Azure container, Azure SQL database, and much, much more in this sense. And I get things I really need to take care of. So this is a really interesting tool. I can highly recommend the Cloud Journey Tracker to find out where you are in your cloud journey, and then also find the gaps in your cloud journey and what you actually need to focus on. Because as I mentioned, there's a big part when it comes to your cloud journey, right? You can quickly lose the overview about what's going on. And so this tool really helps when it comes to that. Another part I want to show you is actually our quick start service. So here I'm in the Azure portal, right? And I'm actually going out and deploying stuff, creating certain things and so on. But I probably need some guidance, right? And so I don't necessarily always want to leave the Azure portal when I'm working on. So if you actually go and search for the Quick Start Center, we will have a couple of different projects here which explain you how to do things, right? For example, how do I create a web app? How do I deploy a virtual machine? How do I deploy and run container-based apps? But if you scroll down, you even have more things to go. So you have an Azure setup guide, which takes the knowledge from the cloud adoption framework and tells you how to actually set up your Azure environment and how to secure it. Or we also have the Azure migration guide, which is also from the cloud adoption framework. And it goes through and gives you guidance on how to actually do a migration, from giving an overview over to an assessment, like deploying workloads, migration focused cost control, and much more. So you don't even need to leave the Azure portal, and you can use the Azure Cloud Adoption Framework best practices. So these are a couple of very interesting tools you can use. You have the links right here. Again, if you want more, you will get the presentation available to you with all the links. Now, I talked a little bit about these pillars, about the strategy, the planning part, as well as the readiness part. What is also very important is actually kind of like to know what are the motivations and scenarios why you're actually going on this cloud journey, right? And so the cloud adoption framework also takes care of this, and it really helps you to find out and challenges you to find out what are you actually, why are you doing this, right? And usually these are triggered by some business critical events like data center exit, like data center leases who don't get extended, mergers and acquisitions, and obviously much more. And then it comes to different actual motivations, right? There are migration motivations like cost savings, increasing of business agility, optimizing of internal operations. But then there are also some innovation factors like innovation motivations going on. For example, preparing for new technology capabilities, building new technical capabilities, or scale to meet the market demands, and again, much more of these challenges. And I think it's very crucial and critical that you understand like what are your motivations of the cloud journey. So when it then comes to actually going out and building solutions on Azure, there's not just one way, right? I talked about that before. It's not just about migrating, for example, workloads, but that is definitely one scenario, is actually when I want to move a certain workload or multiple workloads or all my workloads to Azure. So actually, how do I actually migrate these existing workloads? And you can see here the Cloud Adoption Framework can help you with that as well. And each of these parts, again, has different things you need to take care of. Again, it goes about starting from strategy to plan to readiness to adopt, but then also in the whole governance and management process. It can also be used if you actually build new products or services in the cloud, right? Even then, we also go out and look at strategy, planning, governance, management, readiness, and adoption of the cloud in that sense. So it's not just like the cloud adoption is not just for migration, it's also actually when it comes to innovation and building new products and services. Now, I also talked about tools and templates, and I showed you, for example, the Cloud Journey Tracker, but there is much more, which we unfortunately don't have time to talk about it. So we created this list here of different tools, templates, and assessments you can actually use for your cloud adoption, right? So I already talked about in the strategy part, for example, when you have a look at, for example, the cloud journey tracker to find out where are you actually in your cloud journey and where do you have gaps. I also want to quickly highlight especially the Azure DevOps generator, which actually helps you when it comes to planning. It creates your work items in Azure DevOps, so you can actually create them, plan them, and then assign them and keep track of where you are. And then there are multiple other things which we have here, like templates for example, the landing zones. And again, Dominik will talk a lot more about that. But we also have things when it comes to actually to operations part, like governance management, right? One of the tools I really like is, for example, the governance benchmark, which goes out and checks how far are you with your governance strategy and implementation to find out, okay, where do I have gaps? What do I need to do? And then we have other parts where we talk about, for example, the Azure well-architected solutions. And again, Dominik at the end will talk a little bit about that as well, very shortly, very briefly about it, but that's also a very important part in that as well. Now, again, you will get all these links to find that tool, but you can also find them on microsoftdocs.com, where you can find more about that. Now, to make the next part a little bit easier to understand is, let's talk quickly about Azure landing zones, right? When you are actually moving workloads to Azure, you actually want to configure your Azure environment the way it needs to be configured. This includes multiple different parts of it, but it all comes down to technology implementation, governance, security, and all of that. And that is actually where we have a set of examples for different landing zones. So why do we actually need landing zones, and why it's so crucial, and why not just offer one solution, right? There is, like, if you build different things like a house, a stadium, or a bridge, you actually have different foundations, right? It's not the same if you build a house, a stadium, or a bridge. You actually need to have different foundations. And so that is important when thinking about cloud adoption as well, because probably have different needs when it comes to actually deploying your workloads or your Azure environment. Now, this is exactly where we have our landing zones coming in, and the value of creating cloud-ready environments. So with that, we are actually aligning to business priorities, cloud design consideration, adapt for the cloud operating model, ready for cloud applications, adapt and grow and expand, and obviously make sure that we are compliant, right? With that, to bring that all together and make sure that we are actually keeping the agility of the cloud, and we can actually deliver cutting edge innovation while keeping the whole thing secure. So Azure landing zones help customers set up their Azure environment for scale, security, governance, networking, and identity, right? So I think that is a very important part, that you understand what it all brings together. It helps you to set up your multi-subscription environment to actually make sure that you can implement all of that in a way which works for your environment. So these landing zones, when we built them, they actually help you then not just to migrate your existing application, but also deploy net new applications as well. And then obviously they're not just focusing on, for example, virtual machines or IaaS workloads. They're also focusing on basically all the platform resources, and they do not differentiate between if it's IaaS or PaaS, right? These landing zones are built to support all of that, and making sure that even applications can work together, because some applications you build solutions on top of that using PaaS services and IaaS services combined, and so it's very important to understand that they need to work together. So again, making a step back, this is the cloud adoption framework, and you can see here that the landing zones actually come together in the readiness part, right? This is when we go out, we actually define our business strategy. We have a plan how we actually gonna move forward. Now, we need to prepare people, processes, and obviously the Azure environment for that change. So, in a technical way, before I give over to Dominik, what are actually the design areas of Azure landing zones? So they start with the enterprise enrollment, right? We think about, okay, how do we actually set up our Azure environment? How is that, like, what are the identities here as well? Then speaking about identities, thinking about, okay, how do we actually integrate, for example, where the user identities are coming from, which Azure Active Directory, how do we use role-based access control and stuff like that. And then how are actually resources organized in my environment? How do I deploy, for example, different subscriptions and management groups, and how do I organize my environment as well? And then very importantly, which needs to be a big part of that as well, is the combination of network topology and connectivity. So how do I set this up? Am I living in a cloud-only world where I actually only need to be careful about, okay, how do I actually secure public endpoints? Or do I live in a hybrid world where I need to have a hybrid connectivity like site-to-site VPN or ExpressRoute, for example, and how do I combine that? How do I then set up my virtual networks to, for example, a hub and spoke networking design? How do I implement network peering, and how do I make sure that all these services can work together? So I can, for example, have shared services connecting then with different applications and subscriptions with different virtual networks. So a big part of that, and again, this all comes together. It also focuses on business continuity and disaster recovery. So I want to make sure that I actually implement that in the right way, because I want to make sure that we have a certain set of availability when it comes to your application, right? And again, there are different levels, right? Depending on what you need, you can scale your availability up or down, really depending on what your actually business needs are. And then obviously, I mentioned that many times, it focuses about governance. So we need to make sure that we can keep control of our environment, but not really lose the speed and agility the cloud offers. And then different deployment options, like how do I deploy these services? How do I actually deploy new services? How do I changes to my environment? So this can be, for example, like things like Azure DevOps, and how do I build these services with pipelines? And then obviously, how do I do operations? So if I set up my environment that way, how can I do operations? How can I make sure my environment is ready? And how can I actually train my IT operations stuff, and how can we include them to actually do the operations on this environment? So this was a quick overview about why cloud adoption and why cloud architecture is so important, and a quick introduction to the cloud adoption framework. And now I want to hand it off to Dominik, who will talk more about the enterprise scale landing zones from the cloud adoption framework.
Thanks a lot, Thomas. Now, welcome to the second part, where we talk about the enterprise scale architecture, which is one option to build Azure landing zones. In the next few minutes, I want to talk about what enterprise scale is about, the design principles, the 8 critical design areas. I want to touch on the included, delivered implementation and reference architectures. There's a hands-on demo part to show you how this will look like in the Azure portal experience. Then on top of enterprise scale, what's next? A quick teaser on the well-architected framework. And before going into the Q&A, we have some resources and next steps that we would like to highlight. But now get started with the enterprise scale architecture. A good analogy to enterprise scale is Metropolis. So similar to how city utilizes all the core services such as water, gas, electricity that have to be and are accessible before new houses and new buildings are constructed. The same you have with enterprise scale in the context of Azure. So you talk about, or instead of talking about water and gas, you talk about virtual networks, identity access management, specific rules, security policies, management and monitoring features. So a lot of different so-called shared utilities that must be available, must be ready before application teams starting to deploy workloads on Azure. So again, a very good analogy between Metropolis and enterprise scale. Now, enterprise scale, first of all, is part of the cloud adoption framework, or more precisely, the ready part of the cloud adoption framework. It has been announced earlier this year, and enterprise scale is an architectural approach and the reference implementation. So it's not an Azure product, it's not an Azure service that you will find in the Azure portal as, for example, virtual machines or SQL database. Enterprise scale is a collection of artifacts, and it is available and published on GitHub. So you will have access to all those artifacts, to all the design recommendations, to included policies and templates and scriptings in GitHub as part of the repository. So as I mentioned, enterprise scale is an architectural approach, reference implementation. It's very important to highlight and call out it is proven because it's based on the success of very large migration projects. It's prescriptive. That's also something that you haven't seen so far in the cloud adoption framework. It doesn't just offer and list available options. It gives you and all the other customers a very clear plan, very specific recommendations how to, for example, implement the virtual network for a very large scale migration project, for a large scale, at scale cloud landing zone platform. The enterprise scale architecture itself is based on design principles. As I mentioned, it includes design recommendations, and obviously those recommendations are based on decisions and considerations. We have 8 of those different design areas, which I will talk about later in the slide deck. And as I mentioned as well, it includes an implementation guide. So those information are available on GitHub. When we quickly talk about the reference implementations, so again, the reference implementations, they are for specific use cases, or they target specific use cases, whether it is a cloud-only, Azure-only company that doesn't need any hybrid connectivity, or whether it is a company that has express route and hybrid cross-premises connectivity requirements, you have access to those different reference implementations that on one side you can obviously customize based on your specific need, based on your specific use case, or you can easily bootstrap those reference implementation in your own environment. And I will show that later in the demonstration part. Now, this is the high-level view of the enterprise scale architecture in a solution diagram. So don't worry, you don't have to read all the different boxes and building components. I will talk about most of them during the slides or over the next couple of minutes. But yeah, it is complex. It includes all the required services. So this is the plumbing part of the enterprise scale. So obviously that starts with all the commercial components or all the commercial related services that you need in order to even issue subscriptions. And that ends with a methodology, a mindset, and as well toolings related to provide platform DevOps, app ops. So basically use infrastructure as code to manage the entire platform, all the shared utilities, all the shared services. So when we quickly just look at the landing zones, this is a more detailed or zoomed in view on the diagram that you have seen just before. So again, here is this plumbing. That's what you see on that diagram as part of that picture. So we have, as I just mentioned, the networking part, which is already pre-provisioned. So as a landing zone or within a landing zone, you have your own virtual network, and that virtual network is already paired with, for example, a virtual WAN hub, a managed hub, or a traditional manually managed hub that is owned by the Cloud Center of Excellence or the platform team. So this is already there, already pre-provisioned. So that's the plumbing that already happened or happens before the application team gets access to the landing zone. That means the Azure subscription or the multiple subscriptions. It also includes all the other surrounding monitoring management services and capabilities, such as Security Center or Windows Defender, as it is called today, the Network Watcher, all the templates and extensions to have a compliant virtual machine environment, if this is the case. So a lot of additional stuff, additional toolings and capabilities that are deployed, for example, using Azure policies. Good. Now let's deep dive into the design principles. As you can see here, the enterprise scale architecture is based on the following 5 design principles. The first one is subscription democratization, which basically means Azure subscriptions should be treated or should be used as a unit of management, as a unit of scale, as a unit of security, and so on. So it supports business areas, portfolio owners to accelerate application migrations. When we talk about the policy-driven governance, so basically you have a policy that deploys the virtual network, you have another policy that deploys all agents and extensions used in order to have a compliant virtual machine. Then those policies do target the scope of the subscription. So this is what we mean with the subscription democratization. It's a unit of management, monitoring, governance, security, scaling, and so on. Now, I just mentioned policy-driven governance. So obviously, here we talk about Azure policies, whether it is a policy with the effect type audit, or especially the effect type deploy if not exists. So again, Azure policy in order to provide something that is called guardrails. Those guardrails, they ensure that there's a continued compliance and applications, they're always compliant. That means whether the application team uses Azure Resource Manager, infrastructure as code, or whether the application team decides to go and use the Azure portal experience to deploy a specific workload, a virtual machine, a Kubernetes cluster, SQL database, you always have those Azure policies. Again, for example, deploy if not exist policies that do ensure that the resources are always in their target compliant goal state. So again, when, for example, you deploy a virtual machine, there's a policy that ensures that the virtual machine is registered in that corresponding log analytics workspace so that you have all the data available. And for example, the central team can enforce any security update if needed. The third one is called single control and management plane. The idea here is basically that there should be no additional abstraction layer on top of Azure. So that means no cloud broker, no additional customer developed portal or tooling. The idea is really that the experience is always the same. The experience is consistent for AppOps. That means basically in case a central team, the Cloud Center of Excellence or a cloud platform team provides managed operations, or in case of DevOps, where the application team is doing an end-to-end view, a 360 view, so is responsible for the development and as well for the operations of the application. So again, they can choose whatever works best for them. They have that consistent experience because there's no additional layer, no additional abstraction layer on top of it. Application-centric, archetype neutral focuses on the migration and development. So that means the landing zone itself should not differentiate between something that already exists, something that is new, something that is based on infrastructure services, or something that uses Azure managed platform services. So the idea is basically the landing zone should work for all those use cases and not just support one specific type of migration, for example, only infrastructure rehosting or infrastructure lift and shift. Then the last one is about the Azure native design and platform roadmap alignment. So it's basically the recommendations or the set of recommendations to use native platform services and native platform capabilities, obviously whenever possible. And whatever you decide to do, it should be aligned with the Azure roadmap to ensure that new capabilities that we made available can also be used in your specific environment, and you don't have built something that excludes adopting new capabilities, new services in the future. Now, let's deep dive into the critical design areas. As I mentioned, we have 8 critical design areas. So the first one is about the commercial contracts, enterprise enrollment, enterprise agreement-based enrollments, or Microsoft customer agreement-based enrollments. The last one in that list is about platform automation and DevOps. So I would like to quickly touch on all those areas in the next few slides. As I mentioned as well, the design principles, which we have seen before, they do apply across all those 8 design areas or critical design areas. So always keep in mind, whatever we do, whatever we recommend, is always based on the design principles. Good. As I mentioned, the first one is about the enrollment itself. Again, whether it is enterprise agreement-based or Microsoft customer agreement-based. As I mentioned as well, every design area, critical design area, includes recommendations, but as well considerations. So obviously the recommendations are based on all the called out considerations. What you will see in the next few slides are basically just a snippet, some parts of each chapter. So there is much more, but it's just a little teaser to tell you or to show you possible content that you will find in the corresponding area. So the first one, again, enterprise enrollment, basically means we have specific recommendations related to the roles in an enterprise agreement-based enrollment. For example, how to work with the enterprise administrator or how to work with the account owner, notifications. And furthermore, we also have some information, some considerations, and some recommendations when it comes to Azure Active Directory tenants. For example, recommendations related to how many Azure AD tenants should I use, for which scenarios should I create the new Azure AD tenant, should I keep it simple, and those kind of questions that you usually have, also with regards to separating or having different environments. In the identity and access management area, we talk about the authentication against the control plane, so Azure, or more precisely, the Azure Resource Manager, and as well about authentication inside the landing zone. That means how can an application consume, for example, Azure Active Directory, or things to keep in mind when doing infrastructure lift and shift. So obviously then you talk about Kerberos-based applications, virtual machines that have to be Windows Server Active Directory joined, and so on. So it's about extending, as an example. It's about creating. We also have very specific recommendations related to, for example, the use of additional Azure AD capabilities such as privileged identity management, conditional access, and many other topics that you usually have to discuss in the identity and access management area. The next part is about resource organization, so more precisely management group and subscriptions. So for example, we have a very specific view on how the management group structure or tree should look like, especially then within an Azure AD tenant, and how this should look like across different environments. We also call out why, for example, we recommend to differentiate between the landing zones and the platform management groups, and why there are additional identity management and connectivity management groups. We have further information about the subscription quota and capacity, such as you always have to consider there are platform and services specific limits and quotas that you need to address. And the last part as well, obviously, is important for both the platform team, the Cloud Center of Excellence, and as well for the application team. I will come back then later when we talk about the well-architected framework. But again, here we talk about the cost management. Examples are, for example, that there's an Azure policy. So we are back to the policy-driven governance or policy-driven experience. So there's an Azure policy that ensures that for every subscription in the sandbox environment, there's a budget alert created. That means, yes, sandbox usually means you have a lot of flexibility. You can decide, you can define and deploy Azure services in a playground to explore, to learn, to test new things, but you still want to have some kind of a gap or a cost control, and that's where this budget alert policy will come into the picture. Network topology connectivity, that's, I would say, the biggest topic, the biggest area within those 8 or across those 8. There's a lot to be considered, a lot to be recommended. That starts with the obvious one, which is IP address management. That continues with the DNS configuration, the DNS implementation on Azure, especially important if you have a hybrid environment and you also have an existing DNS solution on premises, and new workloads, new applications on Azure must be able to resolve DNS names, and IP addresses for workloads that do run on premises. But on the other side, you also want to benefit from all the new capabilities. So called Azure private DNS zones, private endpoints. So there are a lot of things to consider, and at the end, a lot of recommendations that you have to think about and have to discuss in order to have a properly working DNS environment. When we talk about the network topology, as I already called out, we differentiate or talk about the virtual WAN approach and the traditional hub and spoke model. So we have both options in the cloud adoption. We have both options in the enterprise scale architecture. Sorry about that. And usually it depends on the maturity of the cluster and some additional factors such as usage of third-party network virtual appliances, history, and so on. But both options are valid. Both do have their own pros and cons. And again, the idea is that we have enough design considerations and enough recommendations in order to have customers to choose between the virtual WAN approach, the Microsoft managed approach, and the customer managed traditional hub and spoke approach. It also includes many other topics such as how to secure ingress. That means how to secure web-based applications, web-based APIs, how to secure outgoing egress traffic, how to secure traffic between on-prem Azure, between different landing zones on Azure, and so on and so forth. So there's a lot to be discussed as part of the networking topology and connectivity. In the management and monitoring section, it's all about the difference between platform monitoring and application monitoring and application management. So that's very important to understand. There's a difference between the two. One example is that for the platform monitoring, that includes all the networking and security related logs, audit data, and so on. It is recommended to use a centrally provisioned, or as well at the end, a cloud center of excellence or cloud control plane team owned workspace. Log analytics workspace, sorry, to be more precise. So again, you have that central log analytics workspace. And again, back to the policy-driven approach, you have deploy if not exist policies that do ensure that whenever you deploy a new resource, the policy ensures that the required audit logs, security logs are always stored in that centrally stored log analytics workspace. Business continuity, disaster recovery basically means to make the platform ready, networking, the right management group structure. So to make the platform ready in order to allow business teams to utilize available business continuity, disaster recovery capabilities for managed services, for platform services, and as well for infrastructure-based services. Usually, It's more an exercise and a duty for application teams, but obviously the platform itself has to provide the necessary plumbing. So if, for example, there's a requirement that an application team now needs to deploy in West Europe in addition to North Europe, obviously you need to have a managed virtual WAN hub in West Europe as well. The networking must be there with express route. Otherwise, this business continuity disaster recovery doesn't really make a lot of sense. Yes, the team still should be able to deploy, but again, as the services are not ready, there's no business continuity disaster recovery for the application. So again, the plumbing, the networking part, and so on must be already available. Then obviously security all over the place. So there's one specific section just for security, for the core security, including encryption, key management, and as well compliance. So the hot topic here is Key Vault, obviously. So for example, the recommendations are to use a federated model. Application teams can create as many Key Vault instances as they need in all the regions they do cover. And again, you have a policy that ensures that all the relevant important security data is always stored in that centrally located or centrally provisioned log analytics workspace. There's much more: key rotation, secrets, encryption, in transit, encryption at rest. So a lot of security related recommendations. And now the last one, platform automation and DevOps. This one is about the recommendation to use CI/CD pipelines, to use DevOps models and DevOps methodologies across the fleet. So not only the application team should follow DevOps models and DevOps methodologies by using GitHub or Azure DevOps or anything else in order to deploy their containers on top of AKS, an example. It's also about that the central cloud center of excellence, the central platform team or the cloud control plane team, they should also use DevOps methodologies. They should follow the DevOps model. So basically treat the environment as infrastructure as code. So that's basically the idea. And as part of that, you have a lot of different recommendations to sum that up. Good. So that was a quick view on the design areas. Now I would like to show you how that looks like in the Cloud Adoption Framework. So therefore, let me quickly open my browser. This is now the enterprise scale architecture within the ready phase of the Cloud Adoption Framework. So going quickly to the critical design areas, that's where we have the 8 areas we talked about in the previous slide. As an example, let me go to the security and governance compliance part. So from a structure, it is the same in all the other areas. It usually starts first with the design considerations. In that specific example, it's about the key vault scale limitations, the transactional limits with regards to key and secret operations. And after all the considerations, you also then have the specific recommendations, such as you should use the federated key vault model to avoid transactional scale limits. And as part of that as well, don't force application teams to use a centralized key vault instance. Or another recommendation is basically use deploy if not exist policies to enable the soft delete and purge protection on every key vault instance that is deployed. Again, independent on whether deployment happens through the Azure portal or Azure CLI or Azure PowerShell or any other supported language tooling that can deploy a key vault instance. Now, based on the design principles, based on the critical design areas, I think it is clear and obvious that the enterprise scale architecture is modular. It allows customers, it allows you to start with the foundational landing zones that support a first set of applications, a first application portfolio. And after that, you can add additional landing zones. You can enhance landing zones by adding additional modules. So again, this modular approach allows you to scale alongside all your specific requirements, whether those are technical requirements or business related requirements. it is possible from that perspective. What I mentioned as well is that the enterprise scale architecture include reference implementations for different use cases. So one that you see here is basically called the Azure Scale Foundation, which represents a cloud-only use case. So there is no, as you can see here, there's no specific subscription for connectivity. So there is no hybrid connectivity required. And as part of that, it addresses, again, this specific use case that is cloud only. If we go one step further and take into account a more complex environment that has a history, that means there's an on-premises data center, there are maybe different smaller offices, maybe a multinational company with many different data centers across the world. There we have that connectivity subscription where we talk about virtual WAN, about the traditional hub and spoke model, about peering, local virtual network peering, global virtual network peering, and all the goodness that you need in order to have a global, worldwide spanning network environment. And again, this is also part, it is one of the use cases that you will see in the enterprise scale reference implementations. And we provide all the necessary tools, which means at the end, Azure Resource Manager, a portal experience that allows you to bootstrap either the foundational environment or, as you can see here, this foundational plus connectivity, so a little bit more complex environment. So you can easily deploy that in your own tenant, test environment, or production environment to get started with the enterprise scale architecture. Let's continue with the demo. As part of that, let's start first with enterprise scale, the enterprise scale architecture on GitHub. As I mentioned, it's based on GitHub, hosted on GitHub. It's available there as a somehow open sourced project. That means as well you can contribute, submit your issues, something that you see here already. Good. So again, the enterprise scale architecture on GitHub includes this reference, which means basically all the custom policy definitions that you need for the policy-driven governance. It includes additional documentation, for example, how to set up and get started using infrastructure as code. I will come back to that in a second. It also has included an enterprise scale in a box tutorial if you want to get familiar with enterprise scale in a sandbox environment. So basically, for example, leveraging your Visual Studio subscriber benefits with one subscription. It also lists all the known issues. And again, as I mentioned, contributing is important. Therefore, we also have information about how you can contribute to the enterprise scale architecture hosted on GitHub. Good. So when we talk about the deploy reference implementation, basically the included reference implementations, we have 3 different scenarios covered here. So let me go to that quickly. We have one that is for an Azure only use case. That's the wingtip environment. We have the Contoso, which is about an on-premises hybrid use case that is based on Azure Virtual WAN. And we have another one, the AdventureWorks use case reference implementation that uses the traditional hub and spoke model. For all of them, you will have additional details. So again, going through the Contoso implementation as example, you will get the profile, the prerequisites, an architectural diagram. You will have all the information about the identity setup, custom RBAC roles used and leveraged Azure Active Directory roles and the privileged identity management. You will have a list of all the policies assigned on the various scopes, such as, we have an enforced subscription tag assigned on the Contoso management group scope, and so forth. So all the information required to understand the use case, you will have available here on the Git repository. Now, the easiest way to get started with the Contoso reference implementation, so in order to bootstrap an enterprise scale architecture, is to just click on the Deploy to Azure button. This will open the Azure portal, where we will get a curated view basically a customized Azure template experience that will walk you through all the necessary steps in order to bootstrap the enterprise scale architecture, in that case, the Contoso reference implementation. First of all, I have to select the default region, Azure region for that deployment. In my case, it's West Europe. You click on the enterprise scale company prefix because you have to enter a prefix. The prefix is used for the management group hierarchy on the tenant root group. So let me enter here an acronym, 2 letters. As a next step, you have the options to select whether the bootstrapping process should already create the policy assignment on the given scope, or you just get the policy definition. So the first option here is basically, do I want to have a log analytics workspace deployed in the subscription? If yes, then I have to select the subscription. So this subscription here, by using the picker control, this subscription will be used as the management subscription linked to the management group. Again, I can choose that. As part of that, I can also select and set the retention period for that log analytics workspace. I can go and select yes, no for all the other policy assignments. Again, you get the policy definitions anyway. This here is about the policy assignments on the given scope, which means the management group scope. The last part here is Security Center, or now called Azure Defender, whether you want to deploy that one with the standard tier, which means you get all the security features, the threat intelligence features, not only for virtual machines, but also SQL database storage, key vaults, Kubernetes service, and so on. Or whether you don't need it, don't want to have it, and then you just select no. The next step is to set up and configure the virtual WAN. So this is disabled or set to no by default. Again, if you go to yes, then you have to fill in all the information needed. So for example, what is the subscription used for the connectivity? Again, the subscription used, or the subscription that you select here, would then be linked to the connectivity management group. And then you enter all the required information for the virtual network, the virtual WAN setup. In my case, I go with no. I go next to the landing zone configuration, and compared to the platform management where I had to select the subscription, this here is optional. So again, even if I have no subscription selected, I can decide whether I want to have those policy assignments or whether I don't want to have those policy assignments. Again, the policy definitions you will get anyway. It's really about, yes, I want to have that policy definition assigned to the landing zone management group, then I go with yes. So you have a predefined list. At the end, if you click on Review Create, as usual with any other deployment, the platform validates the selections, at the end configured template. If everything is okay, you click on Create, and then the template, so in other words, it's, as you would expect, a regular JSON template. This template will then be deployed to Azure. So here we go. That's what we selected in the portal in that created view. Here now represented as a JSON extract. Once I have that deployed, as soon as the deployment completed, I have that management group hierarchy that we basically have seen in the slides before. So it all starts with that default management group called DC, as I entered in the prefix text box control. Then I have all the other management group, as you have seen in the Contoso reference implementation. So the one for the sandbox subscriptions, the management group for the platform, for the landing zone. If I click on the platform management group, I have here the management group. And finally, as well, because that's what I selected, my subscription I have here is already linked to the management group, because that's the one used for the management resources. Going quickly to the policies I mentioned, you have all the definitions. So going here to policy definitions, and changing the scope and then changing the type as well will return a list of all the custom policies that you got deployed or that are part of the AzOps reference folder. So basically the bootstrapped custom policy definitions. So we have a lot of deny policies in order to, for example, prevent teams deploying public IP addresses or IP address resources. But again, based on the policy-driven governance, we also have a lot of deploy if not exists policies, for example, and going back to one example here, independent on how many Key Vault instances are deployed and independent on whether CLI, PowerShell, or the portal is used to deploy Key Vault instance, you have here that corresponding deploy diagnostic settings policy that will always, going here quickly through that, so it will deploy or uses deploy if not exists for all the Key Vault instances, and then sets these diagnostic settings so that you have all the needed data. So all the audit events, that's what you have configured here, always stored in the central log analytics workspace. So you remember I selected and wanted to have that log analytics workspace policy assignment on the management group scope. So this is what you have seen here. I have this policy assignment, which leads to the policy definition. And you will also see when you click on the view, the compliance view, that because I did that already, that my subscription here is compliant, because when I go to the resource, which means to the management resource group, I have this log analytics workspace deployed here. So the deploy if not exists policy at the end, or the Azure policy was responsible to deploy that log analytics workspace. And furthermore, I also got an automation account because that specific policy also includes the deployment provisioning of an automation account. And that's what I see here as well. So I have the workspace and I have the automation account that gets deployed by using the deploy if not exists effect type of that Azure policy definition. Good. So that was the bootstrapping experience, how to quickly deploy the enterprise scale architecture in my environment. Now, this is, or that experience was fully based on Azure Resource Manager JSON template. What we just recently announced is also support for Terraform modules. So if you prefer to go the Terraform way, the Terraform path, instead of using Azure Resource Manager, we now have a module available in the Terraform registry. So this is new, has been announced recently. I would say this should look very familiar because at the end you have the same options when it comes to deploying Azure resources by using or by leveraging that Terraform registry, Terraform registry hosted module. So again, the Terraform module will help you to deploy the management group structure, the hierarchy. It will help you to deploy the custom policy definitions, the initiatives or the set definitions, and as well the assignments. And from an identity perspective, it also helps you to deploy and create the role definitions and the role assignments. So similar to the bootstrapping experience leveraging Azure Resource Manager, but again, in case here, you leverage Terraform as a module, as a framework. Good. Then the last part, another option, how you can operationalize and implement the enterprise scale architecture is called AzOps. AzOps also exists on GitHub. So there is a dedicated AzOps repository that you can use. And once more, I would like to highlight that it's not mandatory. So AzOps is not enterprise scale. AzOps can be used by any Azure customer, so it works in any environment where whether enterprise scale has been implemented, has not been, and maybe will never be implemented. AzOps provides a native toolset for keeping the Azure platform up to date. So native toolsets basically means Azure PowerShell, Resource Manager / JSON templates. And again, the platform at the end is stored as source code in a code repository, in a Git repository. That means on the other side, one of the benefits with AzOps is basically that Cloud Center of Excellence, a platform team, can also use Azure PowerShell or can use CLI to apply changes, for example, create a new management group or to create the policy assignment, and then can leverage the AzOps feature to store that change, revert that change back to the code repository so that you have that consistency across all the toolings used to apply changes. So again, in a nutshell, AzOps from that perspective is a primitive CI/CD pipeline. It works for the Azure platform, especially for those resources in scope, such as the management groups and subscriptions. It allows organizations to bring their own resource manager templates as well, if that is the case. And those resource manager templates are then deployed at the designated scope. So important as well from a enterprise scale perspective, obviously there's an integration. So if we go back quickly to the enterprise scale repository, there you will see in the code, we have, for example, here the GitHub folder that includes workflows, so GitHub Actions. And if we just take a quick look at one of them, so for example, the push workflow, you will see that first of all, this is triggered on a pull request. And as part of that, it triggers a job. And that job itself then uses and leverages the AzOps repository, more precisely the main branch. So that means as well, this is the integration between the enterprise scale architecture and AzOps for the operationalization and the implementation. But again, that's optional. Obviously, you can choose and change that based on your need. But again, the benefit is basically the teams, the Cloud Center of Excellence teams, the platform teams, they can use their preferred tooling to apply changes. And by using AzOps, they always have a consistent experience, the state of Azure stored in a GitHub repository. And that's what you see here as well. Just to quickly show you that, going back to enterprise scale, I called it out, mentioned it earlier. There's this AzOps reference folder. So basically the source of truth they use for the bootstrapping, where you see all the corresponding management trees. So this is the landing zone management group. This is the platform management group. And you have all the other artifacts, the scopes that we have seen in the earlier slides and demos as well. So again, this is what you will see as well for your specific implementation, the same structure, the same experience. So the Azure environment as code in your Git repository. And again, it is GitHub in that case, but as you have seen, we have support for Azure DevOps as well to use DevOps repos and DevOps pipelines, or at the end, you can use any available CI/CD tool, any available Git compatible repo to host the Azure state in your environment. Great, let's continue, switch back to the presentation and talk about the well-architected framework. The Microsoft Well-Architected Framework or Azure Well-Architected Framework is a set of guiding rules that can be used in order to improve the quality of applications and workloads deployed and running on Azure. So in other words, the well-architected framework helps you to evaluate workloads and applications against a latest set of Azure best practices. It provides you with a catalog of actionable guidances that you can use in order to improve the quality, especially in those areas that matter most to the business. And as part of that, the framework consists of 5 pillars, which are cost optimization, operational excellence, performance efficiency, reliability, and the last one is about security. From a cost optimization, first of all, this is based on the principle called build, measure, learn. So in other words, you should start small from that perspective. That means go with the pay-as-you-go strategy for a first architecture. You learn based on that one, and then you invest scaling out that architecture, rather than delivering a large investment for the first version. As part of that, you have to know and you must be aware about hybrid benefits, about Azure reservations, when you should go with reservations versus the pay-as-you-go approach. You have to learn and have to be familiar about all the platform capabilities in order to either shut down a service, to resize a service, and as well at the end, which is the next step, how to modernize and how to move from an infrastructure virtual machine-based environment to Azure managed services. So again, instead of installing a SQL server in a virtual machine, you use the Azure managed SQL database offering. The next one is about operational excellence, which means deployments that have to be reliable, that have to be predictable. Deployments, that means application deployments, resource deployments, they must be automated or should be automated in order to reduce the chance of human errors. As part of that, for example, we talk about infrastructure as code. Deployments should be fast. They shouldn't slow down the release of new features and especially of bug fixes. Furthermore, and even more important, when we talk about automation and predictability, they should be able to quickly roll back or roll forward in case of something unwanted, unexpected happen. That means, in other words, leverage available continuous integration, continuous deployment toolings or pipelines, Azure DevOps, GitHub Actions, and all the others that integrate into Azure. Use available built-in features such as Azure Monitor to understand whether a deployment failed. And as part of that, improve that reliability of your infrastructure or application as code experience. The third one is about performance efficiency. So first of all, performance efficiency means it's the ability of a workload or application to scale in order to meet the demand of the business. There are two ways in order to do that. One of them is vertical scaling, which basically means you add an additional set of compute instances if needed. That's also called the scale up or scale down approach. The other alternative or the other option when it comes to scaling is the horizontal scaling, where you scale out or scale in. That basically means you add new instances. Again, more capacity that is needed to address or meet that expected business demand. As part of that, it is important you always have to run and conduct performance and load testing in order to figure out and understand where are potential bottlenecks. And as part of that, you have to understand what are the metrics, the insights, the telemetry data that you get from your application or from the platform, which you then use in order to identify or trigger any horizontal scaling, whether it is scale out or scale in again, because you don't need the performance. The fourth one is about reliability. As part of reliability, we talk about both resiliency and availability of an application. Resiliency means it's the ability of the system to recover from failures and to continue to function. Availability means it's independent of the case or the situation, users or the availability of users to access your application when they need to access the application. So the goal of resiliency is to return to the fully functional state after failure occurred. And obviously availability means the application should be available so that users can access it. That means in a nutshell, or consequently, Azure provides a lot of resiliency and availability related services such as availability zones or availability sets for virtual machines. Most platform managed services do have a built-in feature in order to provide geo availability as an example. But having said that, you still need to build resiliency into your application. You cannot just rely on the platform. It is part of the shared responsibility model. So again, resiliency strategy or the reliability strategy has to be part at all levels of your architecture, platform and your application. The last part is about security, and similar to the pillar before, it is not just something that you get from the platform and then you can forget about it. You have to think about and throughout the entire life cycle of your application, from the start, from designing an application to the implementation, to the deployment, and at the end, the operation. So security is always end to end. That means, again, you have to understand what are the platform, and you should use those platform integrated features, such as, for example, the DDoS offering of Azure. But at the end, you need to integrate all the additional capabilities into your application. For example, integrating an authorization framework based on Azure Active Directory, providing additional data encryption based on available SDKs, and so on. So this was the well-architected framework at a quick glance. Obviously, you get all the links to enterprise scale architecture, to the cloud adoption framework, to the well-architected frameworks where you can find a lot of additional information. As I mentioned, we have just recently released a Terraform module for enterprise scale, for the enterprise scale architecture. If you want use Terraform, if you prefer to use Terraform instead of, for example, the AzOps implementation option, as we talked about and I showed you as well. Then from a next steps perspective, again, the main goal basically should be to make yourself familiar with the enterprise scale landing zones, the enterprise scale architecture, make yourself familiar with the well-architected framework, share it as well with all the application teams, the different engineers, software engineers, application engineers. At Ignite, we also announced a new module in Microsoft Learn, which is called Create an Enterprise Scale Architecture in Azure. So it's an opportunity to learn even more about the enterprise scale architecture by going through different modules as part of Microsoft Learn, as part of that experience. And otherwise, you have all the links we talked about, design guidelines, template schemas, reference implementation, additional content, and so on. With that, we want to say thank you for attending, and let's continue in the Q&A session. Thank you.